And welcome to the latest edition of Stalling, a Cobra Wrestling podcast. My name is Brant Parsons. With me, as always, Dan Tria, the wrestling guru of the two of us. And we're back for another podcast. And we just keep getting news and reasons to do that. Of course, this is on the reclassification that came out Monday. Dan, how you doing?
I'm pretty good, all things considered. Never been referred to as guru before, so I guess we're expecting some sort of a spiritual insight, some peacefulness. Oh, came to the wrong place.
Because that's what people think about when they think about us is peacefulness and meditative. Listen, this is a crazy week. I spent a couple of times following the season in communication with the FHSAA and Corey, and we share a love of Arsenal, English football team, and cordial emails back and forth. And he's like, "Listen, man, I'd love to tell you when they're coming out, but it sounds like it might be fall. Some of the ADs want to wait on some of the sports to see if they're gonna." I was like, "All right, that's fine." And then, of course, Monday, June 3rd, the reclassification comes out, and lots to talk about. I've already talked about some stuff with Dan and Jason, and because they wanted to talk about it, and everybody has different things they look for. I'm sure the first thing you looked for was, your district and region, which changed. Anybody just a little bit, but anybody that knew numbers going into this, which you do this more, you follow it more than I do. I usually just report on it. I don't spend a lot of time on the numbers games. I let people tell me what to watch for. Everybody felt Jensen Beach was already in 2A. That was not a shock. I don't know if people anticipated Somerset being included in 2A. So you look well, you did. I guess we didn't talk about that. But so you have Somerset that went up. You have Jensen Beach that went up. Those are the last four state champions in Class 1A are now in 2A, and now in your region 2A4. You have Riverdale, Palmetto Ridge coming back down from 3A. They're now in 2A3, and you just look at, that's the story here, right? 2A is arguably already the most competitive classification in the state, and it just got a lot harder.
Well, I've always looked at 2A as probably on the top and the most wide open. You have several teams that are very competitive that can win it. Obviously, you have your favorites. I would say that usually going into it, Lake Gibson and Jesuit are always the favorites. And then you have others like Charlotte that can come in and do something. Palmetto Ridge now, they can come in and do something. So it's always about matchups in 2A. Where do you get your right matchup? Where are you going to have this wrestler hit that wrestler? Who's going to get the bonus points here? The 2A is always the most exciting. 3A is, and this is no disrespect to any other teams, but 3A is who's going to finish second to South Dade. And 1A, ever since Lake Highland went to the prep circuit, has been basically which team out of 1A4 is going to win it. And as you said, the last four state champions have come out of 1A4, and they have now joined me in my region. So this is a new state of play. 2A, of course, becomes possibly more competitive. Our region goes from being a region where there are not a lot of state places to a region that it's going to be competitive on that level. I don't know if we're going to be able to match the depth and quality of 2A2 and 2A3, but we definitely are going to have more placers. That is for sure.
And then within the 2A stuff that stuck out to me. Now when these come out, most people look at their district, their region. I look at everything. I spent probably 6 hours on Monday just going through every district, checking my records, moving all the teams around, all the schools around that needed to be moved. And some interesting moves there. Winter Springs goes from 2A8 to 2A4. Separated from the only other Seminole County team, Lyman, which is right down the street from them. They stay in 2A8. What it does do is add a little bit of depth and quality to 2A1, which was already getting tougher as Clay and Fleming Island have moved down or up and down respectively in the past few years, and you see teams up in the or is it called the Panhandle in Tallahassee, or is that the Curve? But some teams like Lincoln and Middleburg and Columbia are getting tougher in building, and 2A1 now is tougher because you get a Winter Springs team. Now, granted, they do have 3 state champions that have graduated, but you're always going to get 14
They're
good
always
wrestlers.
good.
You're always going to have 14 tough guys in Winter Springs. That adds to 2A1. And then Tampa Jesuit, who has spent the last 3 years in 2A3, is back in 2A2 as they move up to 2A6. And that also means that for those that love the Jesuit Lake Gibson state duels final this year, that'll happen on Friday now as a regional final, as they are now in the same region for that. So 2 interesting moves, even within 2A, which has gotten tougher all around. Now you have a couple different moves there to watch out for.
Yeah, and we're not going to get into my whole argument about how we need to seed the state duels again, but that right there is the great reason why we should seed the state duels. So Tampa Jesuit going back to 2A2, again, there's always the argument that, and I agree with it, that better competition makes you ready for the big show. So having those 2 teams battle it out in 2A2, there's going to be a lot of people looking at their brackets
Yes.
come time the state tournament, and they're going to be like, oh man, I got Lake Gibson on one side, I got the Jesuit kid on the other side, because there are going to be a lot of 1s and 2s there. But then this is where we get into the whole thing about regional seeding. How many matchups in the regional semifinals in 2A2 are going to be against the are going to be 2 kids who, probably should be in the state finals, and then that messes things up, because if you have, depending on where they fall in the bracket, that could be a whole thing. So it gets very interesting, and there are going to be a lot of people. This is going to be a region that fuels a lot of the arguments about how about how the regional formula might be broken. There are some who think that it might be broken. I'm of the opinion that it could be done a little bit better, but but nevertheless, it's going to be fat. Those regional semifinals in 2A2 are going to be fascinating.
Absolutely. And you probably have the top 2 teams in 2A. I'm looking at what I have for them on my rankings that I'm going to have to redo now. But those are my 1 and 2, Jesuit and Gibson going in, and they're now going to compete on, like I said, the state duels and the IBT.
Yeah.
Another interesting, I want to talk about 2 more moves from region that I think are game changers, and I have to look back to last time Osceola wasn't in 3A5 as the district or 3A2 as a region. They have moved to 3A9, which means they are in 3A3 region now, which has slowly been picking up a little bit of steam. It was when I started covering, it was always the weaker region of the 3A regions, and they've picked it up. Obviously, some schools within the region already, like Wellington, Olympic Heights, have gotten built programs, but you also had Harmony move in. You've had some Orlando in that 3A9 move in with Freedom and such. Now you get Osceola coming in, and it changes both the dynamic of the competition, but also they host a lot of things. And you would think that they might possibly be hosting a region where they would be the most Northwest team, or maybe not the most Northwest team, because there are a few Orlando teams, but a very Northwest team to some of the region. But I will not hide my admiration of how they run tournaments, and when they host a region, everybody wants a region to go as smoothly as it does there. But that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out also.
That's going to be very interesting. Again, most of the schools in Palm Beach County are 3A schools, and I know that for them, it's a hard lift to travel, pay for hotels, come back, pay for hotels again the next week when you have kids get to the state tournament. So one would hope that we could they could put it in a more centralized location. I would imagine somewhere on the Treasure Coast would be probably the best, but I don't know if any of them that are willing to do it. I think we have a couple schools down here in the county who are looking to host it, but since I'm not a 3A school, I'm not too interested in that. I will say though, I know that I'm sure that some people are not too happy that Osceola is in the region. It was like you said, it's already becoming a more competitive region, but now that you have Osceola there, um, again, that's a team that is perennially in the top 5 in the state. And now, in order to go to the state tournament, you got to deal with them. If you're from the perspective of the Palm Beach County team, you got to deal with them. You have to deal with Harmony. You have to deal with Wellington. You got to deal with Olympic Heights, Fort Pierce Central. You got to deal with them too. This region becomes one of those where you could have a pretty good kid end up getting locked out of that top spot, and out of one of those state qualifying spots. This also again, fuels my desire for us to have those 5th place people qualify for the state tournament, which that's quite the issue. But ultimately, it's going to be a much more competitive region. And then you look down to 3A4, and it's kind of like a pick your poison thing. If you're a Boca school, do you want to drive all the way up to Osceola and have all that and have to deal with all that, or do you want to deal with or do you want to have a shorter drive and yet have to deal with South Dade, basically all District
3A16?
Yeah. So I would submit that there are some schools who are in the northern part of 3A4 who are would much rather deal with driving to Osceola and than they would dealing with their region. But again, what we're coming to is we're seeing how the growth of the sport in Florida has created more competitive teams.
Yes.
And this is a good thing for the sport. If it's harder for our kids to get to the state tournament, that in itself is not a bad thing. That being said, we also have a growth in terms of schools themselves. And one other point I want to make is, and this is probably going to get veering more towards a political point, but I'm going to make it anyway. But with the way the state is handling the public schools, vouchers and all that, now what you have is you have a lot more smaller schools that are in 1A, and that's pushing everyone up.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pushing it. So there's a lot of downward pressure pushing a lot of these schools up. Now there are some schools that are, they're always going to be 2A or 3A, but then there are other schools that are, significantly smaller that are stuck in 2A. For example, I would imagine, while I said Somerset was going to go up, Somerset only has less than 1,500 kids, so they have more of a natural matchup with a 1A school like Cardinal Gibbons, which I think has around 1,000 kids. That's a more natural matchup for them than it would be going up against a school like Charlotte that has 2,000 kids, because right there you're dealing with a school that has 25% more population than you can draw from. That being said, he does a great job at Somerset, so I don't think he's too worried. But at the same time, it's when you're looking at the pressure put on public education through vouchers, through all the different little there's no better of a word for me to use than gimmicks regarding public education, you can see how it affects schools. For example, schools in Miami, you have schools that can hold 2,000-3,000 kids in Miami that are barely having 1,000 kids because of all these programs. Does it mean that there are more opportunities for kids, and that's a good thing? Sure. But I also think that what we're seeing how this bleeds into the competition. And what I'm going to be curious about is, do we end up at some point with a 4th classification in the state? Because that might alleviate some of that pressure. But
there's a lot of things on that I want to talk about. I want to talk about the amount of teams and all those things. But one other One other, well, I have it in my thought. One other region move that of significance is Zephyr Hills Christian, who is one of the now certainly one of the favorites in 1A, along with Mater Lakes and probably First Baptist and Cardinal Gibbons. They've moved to 1A2 and now made that tougher and maybe open up a few spots and some of the others. So it was not as a significant move as maybe Osceola as far as a landscape changer. But they moved from 1A3 to 1A2, and certainly that'll be something to watch in Class 1A.
Yeah, no doubt.
Let's talk about the FHSAA's classifications and some of the thoughts I have on them. And listen, and as I wrote on my column, people are going to get, change is tough. People get mad. Everyone can find something wrong in things. My concerns are more on the technical side. There are 410 schools that were classified in this. I can tell you by going through 10 to 15 of those schools have not had a wrestling program. The last few years, they keep showing up on the list. They keep not having a wrestling program. Some of them have been 3 seasons. Some of them have been 5 or 6. One of them, I can't even remember if Pompano Beach ever had a wrestling program. But they
I'm sorry, I got to interrupt. I've been here 16 years. This is I finished my 16th season coaching. I've never heard of Pompano having a program.
Right. And so you have all these, and it's across the board. It's 3A, it's 2A, it's 1A, maybe more in 1A right now, but these are schools that are somehow showing up. They don't have the bigger schools haven't had wrestling there for a while. And I can tell you the last time they competed in the postseason, and it has not been the last 2 or 3 years at a minimum. Like I said, some of them are even longer. You have some 1A schools that don't have wrestling listed on their site as a sport they offer. And so and you kind of touched upon it when we talk about pushing teams up that shouldn't be there. So the FHSA rule is you split the teams up by whatever. If you have 3 classifications, you divide the number by 3. And then once you get that number, then you start adding the excess, your remainder, if you will. If you want to go back to elementary school math, the remainder then starts getting divvied up, starting with the smallest class. So with 410, there should be 136 teams in 3A, 137 teams in 2A and 1A. I don't think there should be 410 teams listed. I would have liked to have been like, all right, Piper, you listed wrestling. You haven't had wrestling since 2019. Are you really having a program this year? Or did somebody just click all the buttons? And Hallandale, you haven't had a program since 2020. Are you really going to have a program this year, or should we not count you in this? Because I can tell you right now, there will not be 410 teams that have wrestling programs come November of this year. And so that affects the total just in itself. I would like to have been to them to take the time to confirm that these schools really are doing this. Bradford, you're listed in 1A. You haven't had a program in 3 years. Are you really bringing it back? You don't even show up on a track search anymore. Are you really having wrestling this year? Those kind of things. That would change the landscape. I don't know how it would change in numbers. I don't know if there are more 1As than 3As that really won't have programs. There's a lot of new schools in 1A that you've never heard of, and you're like, are they really having wrestling? Is Avant-Garde really having wrestling? Is Somerset Homestead really having wrestling? Are these things that
I think Somerset Wellington is on there too?
Yeah. So are these things that did they accidentally click a button? Is there? So that affects the layout. And also, as I said, and I know there's some talk on this as far as who's in 1A and who's in 2A. If the FHSA really did follow their bylaws, there should be another team in 1A. And so
that team would be I don't want to say them, but they are significantly below where the
line is that they drew.
Yeah. And so I mean,
but what the FHSA is supposed to do is put 137 teams in 1A, 137 teams in 2A, 136 teams in 3A. That's how you divvy up the 410.
Correct. And I believe that there are 137 teams in 1A, 140 in 2A, and 136 in 3A.
There's 134 in 3A, 136 in 1A, and 140 in 2A.
Yeah, no, we messed. Now there is something to consider. and I'm sorry to interrupt, Brent, but I know we have a couple teams on the Panhandle that
Yes.
would comfortably be in 3A, but there's geographic isolation issues. So you put them in
Yes.
2A.
So that makes 134
That's
and 3A. So we've accounted for that. We've
yeah.
accounted for up to 140 on 2A, but so it should be 139 because, as I've said,
Mm-hmm.
2A should have 139 school or 137 schools. So that would bring up to 139. Yet they're at 140. Class 1A is at 136. So there is a based on the and I wrote the bylaw actual number in my column yesterday. I'll even pull it up here so I can be completely accurate. It is the 12.6.2.1 if you want to read the bylaw. So the FHSA should have one more team, which you would be the bottom team in 2A, should be in Class 1A to even out the way they have it set up if you have 410 schools. The other interesting thing along that also is in those same sets of bylaws, when you get over 400 teams, you can start looking into another classification if that's something. So that could end up being in the discussion as you brought up down the road, though I still argue there are not over 400 schools that have wrestling programs.
Mm-hmm.
There are 410 claiming they do, and that could necessitate a fourth classification.
Well, here comes something.
This is all inside baseball, but yes.
Yeah. So here comes something from the Daniel Tria school of thought of possible common sense. If it's me, I go through every single team that competed in the district tournaments this past season.
Yes.
And that's my basis. That's where I start. Now you have new schools coming online, and you can't necessarily say in the new school, well, I don't necessarily trust you. I'll give you an example. Let me ask you a question. Indian Rocks Christian, do they still have a wrestling program?
I have not seen it for a while.
Okay. Well,
And
you
I don't believe
remember.
I do remember they did for a couple years there.
Yeah, and they were really, really good. I
They were.
remember them. I remember them. I was that's when I was at Laley. So they had a program, and they were like gangbusters. They were really solid for about 3 or 4 for about 2 or 3 less than 5. I'm gonna say around 5 years at the most. They were really solid. They were killing it. And now they just disappeared. And so this is kind of the fate with some of these programs. But you can't also sit there and say, well, you're a really small school. I don't necessarily trust that you're going to have a program. I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe that athletic directors have to sign off at the end of the year or at some point on, are we going to have this program?
Yes.
Now, I am going to brag a bit. For many, 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 many years, I had who I believe is the best athletic director in the state. She's since been moved up in the district, and the person who's replaced her, she's so far been excellent. So I'm really lucky because I've had two athletic directors here who pay very careful attention to all the different things that are going on. But how many of them are just, like you said, checking boxes and not having a program? So if it's me, the basis for me is who actually competed in your district tournaments. Does that mean if you have one wrestler competing, okay, that's fine. You're in.
Yep.
But that's where I start. And if you did not compete in a district tournament, then you don't get to say you had a program. You get to be bumped to independent if you do have wrestlers show up. For example, in Palm Beach County, I want to say the school with one of the largest amounts of state placers in the history of the county's wrestling is Glade Central. Glade Central hasn't had a program in over a decade at this point. And if they had said on their, if they had said we're going to have a program,
2015, the last time Glade Central competed in the postseason.
Okay, so if they say, hey, we have a program, is the FHSAA just going to say, okay, automatically you're back in, or do they have to spend the time for a year as an independent? I've seen it happen both ways. I mean, I looked this year when I was doing my projections, I included every single team in a district, and there were teams that I was shocked to see. For example, we have a high school down the road from us here at Suncoast called Inlet Grove. Inlet Grove said they had a wrestling team. I was like, Inlet Grove's in the district. Inlet Grove has never wrestled. And I even went to my ID and said,
I
Inlet has
remember
a
that.
wrestling team? Yeah. And I'm like, what the heck? So I don't know what's going on. I don't know if people are just checking a box saying they have a team or whatever. But and I realize that this is a big job, because not only are you doing classifications for wrestling, but I get you're doing for winter sports, you're doing classification for soccer, for cheer, for basketball. You're doing a lot. But at the same time, this is something we got to get right. And I recognize that soccer and basketball, both boys soccer, both boys and girls, those are very large sports. There are 7 different classifications. And so you're really tasked with a job there. But, maybe this is something where, maybe the FHSAA should just, have me do it.
I mean,
Me, me,
there's
and
more
I'll
logic
tell you
in
what,
that.
we could have me and Billy Panky do it.
Yeah. I mean, there's more logic in that than just saying, "Hey, click a box if you're going to do it." Because again, uh, as I said, Piper keeps showing up as having a team. They haven't had a team, and I can't remember the last. I'm looking on my sheet here. I can't even find them on there. There it is. 2019, last time they had a team, they finished 10th. Their last 3 years, they finished bottom of their district. They haven't had a program. Their AD don't even write me back anymore when I ask if they're going to have a program this year. But yet they're
Probably
there.
laughing at the email.
Probably I'm probably in a automatic spam by now. And this is just 3A. Miami High hasn't had a program, and they're listed in this thing this year.
They're the Stingerees, right?
Yes, the Stingerees, one of the classic oldest high schools in Miami. I have friends and family that went back in there, years and years and years ago. So those are the 2 teams that stand out to me just in 2A, or in 3A. But then in 2A, like I said, there's Hallandale, I think, or maybe they might be 1A, but like there's all of these schools that didn't compete last year. Boyd Anderson keeps showing up as being someone that's going to have a program. They do not have a program. The last time Boyd Anderson competed
was against me.
Yeah. So why, I don't know what the answer is, but if you don't compete in the postseason, then you don't get to be in the postseason next year automatically. You have to have some sort of application
only
process.
If you are a brand new school.
Exactly.
For example, like Dr. Garcia here in Palm Beach County, brand new school. Yeah, they get to compete right away. But if you're a school that does not compete in the postseason, you got to sit on the sidelines for a year. If you don't field a team, or let's make it even simpler. Let's say that your team, let's say you have injuries and whatnot that prevent you from competing at the district tournament. But if you don't compete at all during the season, you don't no, you're not allowed.
There can be a waiver process. There can be
absolutely.
St. John Newman is a hugely athletic school in the Southwest Florida. They've not had wrestling. They've added wrestling this year, so they are a school that's been around, but they're adding wrestling. Blaine Ison's going to be the coach. We know they're going to have a program. You can petition to that, and then they are going to be in 1A, and that's fine. But there should be a process for schools that haven't had wrestling that now are showing up on this list to say, hey, you got to prove to us you're going to have wrestling. Who's your coach? What are you doing? What are these? And if you can't, then you're an independent. And then that it doesn't matter if you have a team or not. But then you aren't messing around with where people are located and where they should be located in the classifications.
More than that, if you did not compete, if you didn't compete in the 23-24 season, you don't get a spot in the 24-25 season.
Yeah.
I just,
barring, as you said, if there's an injury or issues, or
I mean, if you don't have a single weigh-in, I can go on Track Wrestling right now and I can look at some of these teams that, like Inlet Grove. I'll just give them as an example just because they're right down the road from us. I have no problem with Inlet Grove having a program. I think it would be good. I believe that any school that offers wrestling is doing their school, and it is doing their school great service. And schools that don't, this is a missed opportunity. But if Inlet Grove says we're going to wrestle, and they don't wrestle, if they want to come back on next year, they have to serve time as an independent.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know if there's something connected to money or whatnot. I would imagine, I'm going to put my cynical hat on for a second and say there probably is. But if you're going to, if you're affecting people, you are affecting people who are taking this seriously. And I just think that there's got to be more oversight from the FHSAA about this particular process, because how many teams are adversely affected by the fact that there are phantom programs that are getting counted as real programs.
So a great example of that, and it's one that stood out to me, and I was curious what happened, is 1A14 last year had 4 teams. The last 2 years have had 4 teams compete in the district tournament, and only one of those was a full team in Cardinal Gibbons. Coral Springs Charter was close to a full team,
Yeah.
and then they had Pinecrest and can't even think of the other team. St. Andrews was the other team. So those 4 teams. You show up, you weigh in, you're in regions. So they expanded this year. It is now has 9 teams listed in it, and Mater Lakes moved there, so they get away from Somerset and they end up in Cardinal Gibbons district, and so you have 2 of the best teams in the state in that one. But then you have Avant-Garde, who has no mention of wrestling on their website. Hallandale, who hasn't competed in the postseason for years. Carroll City, which did compete last year in wrestling, but not in postseason. But I looked it up. They have wrestlers. They had events. They competed last year. You have Pompano Beach, which nobody knows when they've ever had. They host the BCAAs every year because they have a great gym for it. I don't think they've had wrestling in the 20 years I've covered it. And then you have Stranahan. It doesn't even list wrestling on their website. They haven't since their coach moved away and such. So you have 3 out of those 9 teams or 4 of those 9 teams may not even have a program. It does expand because Carroll City does at least have a program as of now, and you get Mater Lakes. But so there's 3 teams just in that district that messes up the whole classification of everyone, because that would then make 417. Or if those 3 teams aren't playing, it's 407. Now there's an extra team in 1A, so you have 2 teams that should be in 1A that are going to be in 2A now, possibly. And that you can go up and down the line and see. Miami Springs is in 1A15. They haven't had a program for 3 years.
I remember the last time Miami Springs had a program. I remember that. Again, I'm going to beat a dead horse here real quick, but 1A is always going to be very transient as far as teams that have programs and teams that don't, because these are smaller schools, and and this is nothing against them. I mean, they might have a situation where they have a bunch of kids interested and then they don't. I'll give you an example. I was talking to a guy in Vermont, of all places, about Vermont wrestling, and in Vermont they've had the same team win the state title for the past 30 years. They host the state tournament in a high school gym. And basically, if you are a kid and you have wrestled, you're competing in the state tournament. So everyone there is a state qualifier. But that's because the state is so small. And what the guy said is the reason why that one team wins every single year is because they're the one team that has a program pretty much every year. He said you will see teams, they'll come on for 3 or 4 years because their coach has a kid who wants to wrestle, or their coach is a father who has a kid who wrestles, and they'll be doing great things for 3 and 4 years, and then they're gone. There's nothing wrong with that. It's, you're giving kids an opportunity to compete, but at the same time, there has to be some understanding of the transience that's built into some of these sports. Now, with the example you provide with Piper's a 3A school. I would suspect that, school, let's say they have 2,500 to 3,000 kids, you can find some wrestlers there. It's not hard. They just probably don't have a coach or whatever. They don't have a situation. But why are we listing them as wrestling when they haven't shown any evidence that they are wrestling? So it's 2 different types of things going on. I understand if a school has a program because they have a cohort that's interested, and then they don't, because if you are a smaller school, it's a lot harder it's a lot harder to find some of the resources that would support a wrestling program. That being said, some of these smaller schools, some of these more private schools, they they have different access to resources than we do at public schools. Um, so there's that going for them as well. I would just say there's got to be a bit more oversight here. I realize that the word oversight in the state of Florida is not exactly one of the more favored words, but it's, you know, again, I realize football is the king, but would we allow this type of thing to happen with football? I think not.
No, I mean, and or basketball probably either.
Hmm. Or
If we're being
baseball.
honest, or baseball, softball,
Hmm.
probably volleyball also. Um, but and I want to say something positive to end this, because I know when these kind of things come out, people do resort to the negativity on it. But the fact that there are so many hard paths, and I wrote this in my column,
Hmm.
the fact that everybody has all these hard paths shows how far wrestling continues to come in this state just in the last 10 years.
Yes.
And there was a time when I first started covering this, and a few years in, where you had basic bye matches at state.
Hmm.
You had
Yep.
easy matches at the state tournament. There are very few easy matches at the state tournament, and they're only easy for like 20 wrestlers anymore. Uh, there are not the blood rounds are tough now.
Hmm.
Just getting to the state tournament is harder now than it was to win in the state tournament 10 years ago. The
Yep.
the top wrestlers in Florida have gotten better, but more importantly, the depth of good wrestling in Florida has gotten better over the last 10
Absolutely.
years. And that shows up in this also, because you're like, oh man, I got this hard path. Everybody is getting a hard path. And that continues to happen. And that is a testament to where the sport has come. In the 20 years that I've been covering, it is so much different now than it was in those middle years. When the sport was being canceled from the Olympics, and every time I talked to someone, it was like, oh, I don't know what we're going to do. The numbers are down and all this. We haven't had that conversation in years, because it is a growing sport. The girls have helped it grow. But overall, the state has grown, and it's coaching and its kids and its programs devoting some resources to it, and that has made paths harder for everybody in the state, no matter how the classifications step out. And I think that is a positive that we can always bring up when talking about it in Florida.
I would agree completely. You had a coach in your article that you wrote yesterday say that there's no one that's going to be happy with how this shook out, and I agree with that sentiment completely. I look at my district. My district now is Jensen Beach and Martin County, and of course we know who Jensen is. And Martin County they were pretty tough this year. So I look at it as, I say this to my kids all the time. Champions find opportunity. Let me start again. Champions find opportunity in difficulty. So the way I framed it to my boys was simply this: hey guys, if you can compete with and beat the wrestlers in our district, then you're setting yourself up well for the region and the state tournament. And that's no disrespect to the teams that have been in our region the last 5 years, but you do the numbers, and 2A4 has not been very competitive on the state level. It's just a fact. So having to go the hard road is a good thing. There's been much better coaching coming into the state. There's been more of an emphasis on wrestling. The only thing that is a little, and I'm sounding all gloomy and everything like that. I'm really not. But the only thing that gives me a little pause about the state of wrestling in Florida is the blowing up of the club scene, because I just don't like pay to play as a model. I think that excludes people, and that's a discussion for a whole other podcast. But what I was going to say is, it's more competitive. You have to be a better wrestler to get to the state tournament. Why?
Yes.
When I first started here, and our tournament is named after Max Desir. Max is one of the first wrestlers I ever coached, and he was a veteran. He tragically took his life about, gosh, I want to say 12 years ago. Had some PTSD in the military and coming home and all that. But one of the things about Max is Max had this great double. fantastic double leg. But Max was not a very good wrestler from the top and bottom positions. If you got him on the mat, you could hold him down. And if he was in the top position, he was not the best at keeping you down. And so you could be a one-dimensional wrestler 16 years ago when I started. I love Max dearly, but he was a one-dimensional wrestler. He had a great double leg, and that was it. And so if you figured out how to stop the double leg, you figured out how to stop Max. That said, it's a lot easier to say than it was to do. That type of wrestler is not getting to the state tournament anymore.
Right.
So that is an overall good thing. I'll give you other. I mean, in with my team, an example that I would point out right away is Holden Capsis. Everyone knew Holden was going to hit that dump, and he would hit it. He hit it on some fantastic kids, and he got to a point where he was pretty solid on the mat wrestling. So he was good in all three positions. He would definitely be someone going through today. And we had something a few years ago where my state placers came back. Anthony Lamaro, he came back to the wrestling room, and he was rolling around with Holden. And he said to me, "Coach, how did he not place?" I said, "It's gotten tougher, buddy. It's gotten tougher because Holden was just and Anthony was a fantastic wrestler, but Holden was a much more well-rounded wrestler. You have to be well-rounded today." That's a really good thing. I think that the thing that's going to make Florida jump levels is when we see a lot more of these matches that are decided on the mat in terms of and not so much a neutral position. We're still a very neutral heavy state. But when we start seeing people riding someone out, for 2 minutes, or someone on bottom, hitting more complex moves from bottom, that's going to be a very interesting development. We are a state that's definitely ascending in terms of wrestling, and I think that and there's another argument I'm going to get into, and I'm sorry to ramble. There are some who think that the idea of having classifications is a bad idea because we should just have one single state champion. And I couldn't disagree more, because I think the opportunity to get to wrestle in higher level matches is important for kids. So
Yes.
even if you're saying the competition is diluted, and I will not make a point to argue it, because by having 3 different classifications, the competition is diluted. When we're celebrating the sport of wrestling by having a whole bunch of kids in Kissimmee competing, you're going to bring in more kids. The success of Florida wrestling has been that we have several classifications and several kids feel like they can get to Kissimmee and wrestle. Having wrestled in New York at the time I wrestled, there's only a single state champion. And in order to get out of my section, you needed to win the county. Not an easy feat. I would say that our county tournament, because we were divided into sections, our county tournament was, it was as tough, might be even tougher than Florida state tournament. So just getting to the state in New York was like a massive accomplishment, let alone winning it. And how many wrestlers were, looking at the road and saying, I don't know, it might be a little bit, I might have a better shot at some other sport. Of course, there are people who are going to say, but that's what wrestling teaches you. You got to be determined. You got to work hard. It's not about winning or losing. It's about, and I get that, but we got to speak realistically. If kids aren't going to see an avenue for success, they're not going to be as interested. And one of the things that this sport has in Florida is it has multiple avenues for kids to experience success. So that's a good thing. And so what we're seeing that more kids are entering into the sport, more kids are experiencing success, and they're experiencing meaningful success because they got to do it the hard way. But the last point I want to get to of what you just said is I don't want to minimize the impact the girls have had. If it wasn't for girls and women, we would have a very, very unhealthy sport of wrestling. Women saved it at the Olympic level, and in the college level, we are not seeing the same rate of attrition of college programs that we were prior to the introduction of women's wrestling. So I'm really hopeful that with women's wrestling basically becoming a varsity sport in 2026, that we're going to see a lot of programs. And this is going to be a great opportunity for Florida wrestlers to get themselves a little bit more noticed, because I do think that there is a bit of a bias against Florida wrestlers at the collegiate level, like, oh, they're just not that good. And maybe it's earned, maybe it's not, but we've seen Florida wrestlers, become All-Americans. But I think from the women's point of view, that could be a real game changer for the state. So, and I'm not saying that you minimize the impact, Brant. I'm just saying that that's something that we really need to highlight.
Champions find opportunities in difficult times. Is that what it was? Is that your quote? Or
champions find opportunity in difficulty. I stole it. I steal all my good stuff, as you know. I stole it from someone.
Because I want to make a shirt. That's not on your shirt, right?
No, this year our shirt is going to be if we can do it, wonderful. If not, fail in the most beautiful way.
Okay. I want to make another Cobra shirt, so maybe that's the one I'm going to mark that up. I just didn't know if I had to attribute it to you or someone else. I like it.
You could attribute it to me, but you'd probably be wrong. Let me look it up real quick.
And while you're looking it up, I'll wrap things up. Thanks everybody for coming on this journey to talk or listen to us talk about classifications and everything else going on in the wrestling world. We promise to do more of these as the summer grows and get some people on here and talk wrestling. And as always, thank you for your support of Cobra Wrestling, and Dan and I thank you for your support of this podcast. Did you find it yet?
I Googled it and it just came out. I think it's somewhere.
I got a producer off stage waving me up, playing the music, so we'll just assume that it's our quote now. Final word.
Special.
Final word from you, or is that it?
Final word. Stop messing with my sports teams, man. You're killing me.
All right. Have a great one, everyone. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Stalling, a wrestling podcast brought to you by Cobra Wrestling.
Thanks for tuning in to Stalling, a Florida high school podcast produced by Cobra Media. Stalling can be found on your favorite podcast platform, including Apple, Spotify, Google, iHeartMedia, and more. Remember to follow, rate, and share if you like the podcast. Look for Cobra Wrestling on social media and give us a follow. Have an idea for a show? Contact us at CobraWrestling.com.
It ain't the 6 minutes. It's what happens in that 6 minutes.